And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, editor Megan Bedell, who's going to introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Melissa. And it really is an honor to be here with everyone around the globe and to introduce our two presenters today, Diane and Mindi. Diane Staehr Fenner is the founder and president of Support Ed, located in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Diane and Support Ed are dedicated to empowering multilingual learners and their educators. The Support Ed team provides professional development and support of multilingual learners, coaching, technical assistance, and curriculum and assessment support to school districts, states, and organizations. Prior to forming Support Ed, Diane was an English language development teacher, dual language assessment teacher, and ELD assessment specialist in Fairfax County Public Schools, Virginia. Diane's best-selling Corwin books include Unlocking Multilingual Learners' Potential, Culturally Responsive Teaching for Multilingual Learners, and Advocating for English Learners. Diane's latest work, Social Emotional Learning for Multilingual Learners, is her 8th book, and it's co-written with today's co-presenter, Mindi Teich. And Mindi Teich is a multilingual learner coach with Support Ed. Mindi has been an advocate for multilingual learners and their teachers for over 20 years. She began her career as an ELD teacher in DC public schools, where she worked with students in pull-out, push-in, and co-teaching environments. While still teaching, she worked with district staff to develop and implement training on collaborative practices for classroom and ELD teachers. Upon joining Support Ed, Mindi has provided coaching and professional development to school districts in Pennsylvania. As a coach, she models lessons, co-teaches alongside teachers, and encourages reflective conversations with teachers and administrators. In addition to her work in schools, Mindi presents often at conferences on topics related to multilingual education. And it was at such a conference back about 2 years ago that I got to see Diane and Mindi present on this very topic. And I'm so excited that they've pulled everything to share with you into this wonderful offering and in today's conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Diane and Mindi.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I just wanted to start off and say thank you so much to everyone at Corwin for hosting us today. This is just a little bit, this is our team, our Support Ed team. And as Megan mentioned, we exist only to support and promote and empower multilingual learners and their families. So this is our core team. So I'm gonna start off just by sharing a little bit, 3 reasons why Mindi and I decided to write this book. So the first reason, and just backing up, our core reason for writing this is just to ensure that our multilingual learners are thoughtfully included in social emotional learning. So I want to share 3 perspectives. The first is the classroom perspective. So as Megan shared, Mindi does a lot of coaching. I do a lot of coaching as well in various school districts. And we've seen wonderful classrooms where our multilingual learners are engaged. They feel a part of things. They're welcomed. They have relationships. And in those classrooms, they really thrive. Their well-being is being considered, and they feel belonging to groups. At the same time, we've also seen some classrooms where there might be a computer program, an SEL, social emotional learning program, where multilingual learners are just one-on-one with devices, not making connections, not really seeing a connection between SEL and instruction and belonging and well-being. So that's kind of the 2 sides of the first reason why we decided to write the book. The second reason is kind of zooming out to the national level. We know that schools are just being asked to do more and more now, especially, they're filling in some gaps where we see that people might not be as involved in communities, for example. Students are feeling also the pull of social media. They're feeling pressure. They're comparing themselves to others. And in addition, our multilingual learners are possibly going through traumatic experiences and dealing with that. They might be facing experiences of racial injustice and a lot of uncertainty about the future. And the third reason why we wrote the book is Mindi and I, we're about the same age. We're moms of each moms of three adolescent kids. And so we recognize the stress that our own kids were going through prior to the pandemic, during pandemic, as we're coming out of pandemic now, when schools shut down. But we also recognize our privilege as native English speakers. We're familiar with school systems. We have the resources to advocate. We bring the privilege of being white educators. And so we recognize, seeing what our own children went through and seeing what's happening in schools, working with teachers and supporting students. We know the many layers of extra challenges multilingual learners are facing. They're facing stress of trauma, relocation, possibly financial instability. There might be cultural dissonance between home and school. And so we saw all of these things happening on these three different levels, and we knew we wanted to really offer our insights and our vision and how we can embed and integrate social emotional learning as a path for multilingual learners' success. And so this is the fruits of our labors that just came out. So this is our book, Social Emotional Learning for Multilingual Learners. These are the chapters. And so each chapter offers practical tools and strategies that you can use immediately. And so the focus is really not on SEL as a standalone program. We know that's happening in a lot of places, but we really want to ensure that SEL is integrated throughout the school day for multilingual learners and that it looks different for multilingual learners. And we're going to share why with you during this webinar today. So we know that current SEL frameworks really usually don't take multilingual learners into account. So our approach draws from research, and it's a very practical way that educators can implement SEL immediately. And today we'll share a lot of tools from our book. But you'll see that the main components are chapters, kind of the meat is chapters 3 through 7, and we'll really focus on that today. So in the chat, we're going to be sharing a link that will take you to this hub for anything that you might need during the webinar. So if you click on session resources, it'll take you to a Padlet, and I'll show you what that looks like in the next slide. And then you can also use this hub to learn more about our SEL online book study that is launching, and also more information about the book. So this is what the Padlet of resources looks like. So you'll see in the left-hand column, I'm talking with my hands, in the left-hand column, we have a copy of this presentation. So you can download this presentation and share it. And then all of the materials we're sharing from today are also in that left-hand column. And then there are other columns grouped by our objectives today, the importance of SEL, the urgency of SEL for MLs, research, and then more tools. So we're sharing a lot with you today. This Padlet link and the hub will remain live, so you can come back to it whenever you would like. If you're doing your own turnaround training around SEL for multilingual learners, please use and share any of these materials. So gave you a lot of stuff to think about. So let's start off with a reflection. In the chat, how are you currently feeling about supporting multilingual learners' social emotional learning, or with social emotional learning? Are you A, I got this, B, I'm getting there, but I have some questions, or are you C, it's one obstacle after another? So please share your responses in the chat.
Seeing a lot of B's.
A lot of B's.
Great.
Yeah, so they're coming fast.
Yeah.
Great. Well, please keep them coming, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mindi.
Okay, so we're going to go into our next section of the webinar where we're going to talk about the urgency to support SEL for MLs. But before we do that, we're going to do sort of just an overview of social emotional learning, just to make sure we're all on the same page around our definitions and what we're talking about. So you see here on this slide a definition provided by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, also known as CASEL. And we'll talk about CASEL probably quite a bit during the presentation today. They're an organization that has been working in social emotional learning for 30 years, I believe now. And they're quite well known in the United States. So when we started thinking about social emotional learning for multilingual learners, we started here with this definition. And then the definition kind of moves into thinking about their 5 SEL competencies, which we're going to get into in our next couple of slides. So thinking about what SEL is, and on the other slide, it pointed out that it's really the skill development for students. We also want to make sure that we are clear on what SEL is not. SEL is not about finding deficits, about identifying what we might call problems in children. We're not looking to control students or to ensure that they're being compliant with our rules and regulations. That's not what we're looking at when we're talking about social emotional learning today. So I just gave you a little bit of an overview of CASEL. And just to get us started, we'd like to launch our first poll, which is going to ask you to tell us how familiar you are with the CASEL SEL framework. You may have seen this wheel, or you may be a little bit more familiar with some of the information in the wheel. So the poll is going to launch, and you should have the option to choose 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And I can't, oh, okay.
It launched.
So we'll give you just a couple of seconds and I see some people are dropping their responses in the chat. That's totally fine. I see actually the range, 1s, 3s, 2s. I see a 5, extremely familiar. So there's probably quite a range of familiarity here today.
Shall we end the poll? I think a lot of people have voted.
Oops. So I wasn't able to see the results of the poll.
Because we're co-hosts, hopefully.
Okay, so actually the majority of people at 35% are somewhat familiar, and then not familiar at all and slightly familiar. So, not a whole lot of familiarity with that framework, but we are going to talk about it a little bit today. And just before we move on, I'll just point out again that, within that wheel, you see 5 SEL competencies. We're going to talk about those a little bit more. And then you also notice around the wheel what CASEL calls the key setting. So the places where this social emotional learning is taking place. And you can see classrooms and schools are in there, but it also includes families and caregivers and their communities. So that's an important piece. So okay. So over the next couple of slides, I'm going to share CASEL's definition for each of these competencies, and then just share a little bit about what they recommend as some skills that we might have students be working on to reach some of these to build up some of these competencies. So self-awareness, as you might expect, is really about helping students understand who they are, understand their identity. So when we work with students on skills in social awareness, we want them to be really aware of their assets. We want them to be able to identify their emotions. And this is where we would also talk with students about a growth mindset. And then our next competency is self-management. So in self-awareness, we taught students how to identify these emotions. And now when we talk about self-management, we're talking about helping students manage these emotions because we want them to be able to achieve goals. So we might work with them on different ways to manage their emotions. We might work with stress management techniques, and we might help students work with planning and organizational skills. And now we're going to move on to social awareness. And as we talk about social awareness, we're moving a little bit away from thinking about ourselves as individuals and thinking about how we interact with others in the world. So when students are working on social awareness, they're thinking about how they might share their own perspective and how they might respond to others' perspectives. We want to teach them about empathy, compassion, gratitude, these skills that involve other people around us. And next, we'll be looking at relationship skills. And I'm sure we're all aware that part of having strong relationship skills is being able to communicate. So we want to make sure that students are able to communicate effectively. We want them to be able to work around conflicts, and we want them to be able to seek or offer help if they need it. And then the final SEL competency is responsible decision making. And when we talk about supporting students with decision making, we want to make sure that they are able to make sound decisions based on information that they are thinking through. We want them to be able to consider consequences, possible outcomes, possible barriers that might come in their way if they make a certain decision. So we want them to be thinking through this decision-making process entirely.
Thank you, Mindi. So I'm going to, Mindi shared about CASEL, the CASEL framework, the most widely known SEL framework, and that's what we built our book around. We adapted the CASEL framework in our book, and you'll see how we do that. And thanks for a couple of you who've shared in the chat, what might look different for multilingual learners. So I want to make sure now that we're all on the same page of SEL and multilingual learners by sharing who multilingual learners are. So we start with our circle of all students. Within this group are multilingual learners, and we define multilingual learners as students whose parent or guardian reports speaking one or more languages in addition to or other than English in the home. So multilingual learners, or MLs, may or may not qualify for ESL or English language development services. But then within that smaller group, we have emergent multilingual learners. Sometimes people call them English learners or ELLs or emergent bilinguals. And so those students do qualify for language support based on their level of English proficiency. And so it's really interesting to see the number and percent of MLs, or multilingual learners, of emergent multilingual learners and MLs in the school-age population. So you can see the EML group, emergent multilingual learners. They're about 10.4% of the school-age population in the US, but multilingual learners are almost 23%. So we're getting to be about at least a quarter of our students do have a different language or different culture. They might not be very fluent in their other language, but they do have that exposure and just a different perspective and a different way of seeing things. So we wanted to be very inclusive in our book, so we include the big group of multilingual learners. So just a little bit about, MLs, but we know that Mindi and I really saw a deep sense of urgency of social emotional learning that's inclusive of multilingual learners. So we know that, the demographic makeup of our teachers does not match the demographic makeup of students, right? So it's very much less likely that teachers or administrators will have deep connections to students' experiences. They don't share the same culture usually, or the same language. And individuals who are not native English speakers have been shown to face a lot more struggles in terms of mental health. I mentioned earlier, much more likely to have been exposed to trauma that might go untreated, and also be experiencing the stress of acculturation. Our multilingual learners often show slower academic growth than non-emergent multilingual learners, and they tend to have lower graduation rates. They also have a higher affective filter if they haven't really built these relationships with teachers or with other students, or feel a sense of belonging and ability to take risks in the new language. So in the chat, just if you would like to share one challenge that you see in your context with SEL for MLs. And let's see, just one challenge. I'll give you a minute. We've shared a bit, values, the different values. Being without their parents, lack of access to SEL.
Oh, now they're coming in.
Yeah, now they're coming in. Yeah. Carrying the weight of the students on your shoulders. I saw that. Yeah, I felt that very much when I was an ELD teacher. Lack of confidence to connect with others, not knowing, difficulty expressing themselves when there is the language barrier, or, they're beginners, newcomers. Mindi and I said that we're here in Massachusetts right now. We don't live here, but we're here supporting the state and supporting the newcomer population. Buy-in from staff, different cultural context. Yeah. Teachers might misinterpret cultural behaviors, and we share a lot about that in the book, about these misinterpretations and where they come from. We, as educators, we draw upon our own cultural experience and we make assumptions, right? Thank you so much for sharing all of these. And I encourage you to keep them coming while Mindi's going to share with us about our framework.
Yeah. So before we even had a book, we started with a framework. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about our framework and what's included in that. So we already talked a little bit about the CASEL SEL competencies. And as Diane shared, really, as we were thinking about these competencies and the definitions and even the skills that are associated with a lot of them, we were thinking to ourselves, like, where and how are multilingual learners going to fit into this? Are they going to be able to access this in the same way as everybody else? So you'll see one of the things that we did when we started the framework was to write an ML consideration, which basically outlined, thinking about this definition the way it is here, what should educators or anybody who works with multilingual learners and is supporting them with social emotional learning, what should they be thinking about in terms of this particular competency? And on this slide, we have just a very brief description of that ML consideration for each competency, but we're going to go through each of them in the next slides and some other information about the framework. So we're going to start by taking a look at the framework structure. And as we said, we did begin with CASEL. So we do start with the CASEL definition, and that's followed by our ML consideration for that particular competency. And then because we really did want this to be something that educators could take and use and implement immediately, we followed this up with 4 educator actions, suggested educator actions. So things that you can immediately implement so that you can start helping to support your multilingual learners with these different SEL competencies. So we are going to go through each of them, and let's start here with self-awareness. And what really stood out to us when we were thinking about self-awareness was the distinction in a lot of the cultural backgrounds of a lot of our multilingual learners. Many come from a collectivist culture, which is very different than the dominant culture here in the United States. So, we thought and we considered and we wondered if students would have the same level of comfort in using this language of self-awareness, the I statements that we use so much when we talk about our own strengths. So that was something that we've included in our ML consideration. And then as far as the educator actions to help support this, we wanted to ensure that educators would be intentional and very aware of what English learners and multilingual learners are already bringing to the classroom. So we want to make sure that we're intentionally validating the culture and the assets that students are bringing to the classroom, while at the same time taking the time to carefully create lessons and scaffolded experiences for students so that they do have the opportunity to practice some key language around self-awareness. As always, we recognize the really important role of the teacher as the model in the classroom. We want the teacher to model the language that we want students to use and the growth mindset that we want them to have. And we want to ensure that educators provide sufficient opportunities throughout the school day. This is where the SEL is integrated and not a standalone. We want to make sure that there are many opportunities throughout the school day where students are able to identify, recognize, and build on the strengths that they do have. So thinking about self-management, what really stood out to us here was this concept of social norms. And we know that social norms are something that we pick up on so much just by being engaged in a particular environment. So it's a really hard thing to just teach to students as they come into a new school environment or into a new community. But we need to recognize that if they're not familiar with the dominant culture, social norms. They may have a different set of expectations within their own culture, within their own family, around self-management. And that may make them feel that they have a bit of a disconnect between what's going on at school and what's going on at home. We're also aware that many of our students are coming to school with having experienced trauma and other types of social indignities, and that they may be reacting or acting out based on what they've experienced. So we want to be really careful as educators are observing some of these behaviors and interactions, that they're not misinterpreting what students are experiencing as a lack of self-management skills. We also want to make sure that we're aware that sometimes students are receiving conflicting messages from their home and school around goals and aspirations for their future. So we want to be aware of that as well. And some educator actions that we recommend to help foster access for students to self-management. Again, we know that we cannot teach every single one of the social norms that students are going to need, but there are some opportunities for teachers and to think very carefully around what would be beneficial for students, especially as they're maybe first coming into a school, what's going to help them really get a little bit more integrated into the school. I'm thinking of things like getting through a lunch line, how students walk through the hallways, how they greet teachers and other people in the school building. So we can be very selective, carefully selective about some social norms that we are going to support students with. When we talk about self-management, we also want to make sure that we're helping students identify their emotions. And when we're providing students support and helping them access some of these areas, we want to make sure that we're using examples that are going to be relevant to students, something that they can connect with. And since we talked a little bit about the disparity between goals between home and school, we want to make sure that we're collaborating with families and we're making the time and the space for families to come in and talk about how the goals that they have for their students and how the school and the family and the student can all work together to meet some of those goals. When we thought about social awareness, we thought that this was a place where multilingual learners might have some very unique strengths that are maybe not always highlighted. These are students that have experience navigating across cultures, and they probably have a great deal of experience understanding and empathizing with people who have been through difficult situations and people from other cultures. However, we also recognize that most students might not really recognize this as a strength. So they might need some support from educators to help them recognize that this is really a unique and meaningful skill that they have, that they can move across cultures. And we also just pointed out that they might also need a little support in recognizing perspectives in the dominant culture that they may not be as familiar with. So some educator actions that we can use to support students with social awareness is, as always, we want students to feel comfortable in their environment, in their class, in their school. We want to make sure that we have materials that they can relate to. The teacher, again, here is going to serve as an important model to discuss and model empathy. And then this idea of really being clear around expectations around academic conversations is going to be very important, because this is the place where students are going to be able to share their perspectives and listen to other students' perspectives. So we want to make sure that those expectations are very clear so that every student feels comfortable engaging in those academic conversations. So our next competency that we're going to talk about is relationship skills. And I saw a lot of people pointing out things in the chat earlier around how communication can be so different in different cultures. And that's exactly what we pointed out in our ML consideration here as well. Just the patterns of interaction can be very different depending on your cultural background and the language that you speak. We also need to be very aware of nonverbal communication, which has different interpretations in different cultures. And there is just a lot of area for potential misunderstandings because of these different interpretations. And also, as students are starting to learn English, there may be some misunderstandings and miscommunications. So as educators, we would ask that teachers support students' different ways of communication. This is going to be another place where we want to really validate what students are bringing, but then teach and support what is present here and what they might see in our country. Another action that we have seen put into place and is really powerful is when schools identify a staff member that will go out of their way to make sure that they are developing a strong relationship with multilingual students, so that students know that they have a staff member that they can go to, that they can confide in, that they can really relate to. And then we also want to work with students to help them with their self-advocacy skills, because this may not be something that students are familiar with in their own culture. And that's something that we certainly expect of students, especially as they get older in a lot of our schools here in the United States. And then our final competency is responsible decision-making. And again, here, when students are not familiar with social norms, the social norms coming up again here, what may appear as a responsible decision to one student may not appear as a responsible decision to an educator or other adults or even other peers in their classrooms. So again, we need to be aware that students may not be aware of all of our social norms. We need to be aware of their possible experiences with trauma and all the stresses that Diane mentioned earlier that the students are going through. They may also have experienced a lot of they may have had some negative experiences that may make them question whether or not their decisions really even matter. So they may be questioning their own sense of agency. And certainly their life experiences are going to impact what to them appears to be a caring and constructive choice. So some educator actions that we would recommend is, certainly to give students many opportunities to share their perspectives. We want to give them opportunities to practice making some decisions, and not only making those decisions, but then explaining the rationale for their choice. And for some students, that might also mean that we need to teach a little bit of the language that we want them to use to explain their choices. And then again, the teacher is going to be a strong model for modeling how you might go through making an informed decision. So to wrap up this section, again, we're going to invite you to drop your thoughts into the chat and maybe just share a word or phrase that describes what stood out to you as I went through and talked about this SEL for ML's framework. And I already see a lot of words being dropped in the chat. Great. Model, express, agency, inclusive, teacher modeling. Great. Social norms. All going to be really important things to be thinking about.
I would love to make a word cloud right now.
I know. I see a lot of validate, and I love that, because Diane and I were so careful in discussing a lot of this to say, like, yes, we want to teach students what's happening here, but we want to make sure that we're also validating what they're bringing with them. So
and in the book we dig into that. What does it mean to validate? How do we define what validating means, and what's the impact of validating our students' experiences? So good. We're glad that you're getting, you're each getting something out of the framework so far. So now, we've shared the why, we've shared our framework, we've talked about CASEL, we've shared a little bit about multilingual learners. So now we get to talk about tools and strategies. So what we have done, we just have a very short amount of time with you, unfortunately, but we have taken the framework. You see the competencies that you saw before and the considerations to foster access for multilingual learners. And now for each of these competencies, we're going to share a tool to foster multilingual learners' access to this competency. So for self-awareness, we have a sentence starters. You can see self-management. So I'm just going to go through these and share one tool or strategy for each competency from CASEL. So for our first competency, this tool aligns with self-awareness competency, SEL competency. So we have here sample sentence starters to support student self-awareness. Wow, that's a lot of alliteration. I just realized it's a lot of S's. So in this tool, you can share it with students prior to beginning a new unit or to increase students' awareness of their strengths, their areas for growth, connections with language and culture, and identifying emotions related to content learning. And this is, really beneficial for multilingual learners, but all students can benefit to some degree from taking part in just this reflection. So an example that we use is a 4th grade student who's working on long division in the classroom. And in their country, they've learned to set up long division a different way. And I realized this when I was teaching elementary students and also, upper level students in the upper grades, that they do division differently. And it's valid. Again, it's validating where they are, but the students are able to really voice their own strengths, their assets, and also what are some limitations and what are some emotions around this. So this tool shares some sentence starters, some sentence frames, some visuals. You can also do this with a partner, use the scaffold of a home language. So just supporting this idea of self-awareness. And again, you'll see this isn't a standalone tool, right? It's not a standalone program. It's really integrated into supporting multilingual learners' acquisition of language and access to content. So that's our first tool. So our second tool, our strategy here is validating and teaching social norms through scaffolded role play. So Mindi talked a lot about social norms, right? Which are our unspoken rules that we don't generally teach students. So this activity, and we also have some tools in the book that support this, aligns with the competency of self-management. And it's a great way also to help develop multilingual learners' language skills. And so, our MLs, we always want to validate their own social norms. And also, they might need some direct instruction in unwritten social norms in the US while validating their social norms. So, for example, some high-need topics might be what's expected in the cafeteria. What's a pep rally? I know teachers who teach lessons on pep rallies, what they are. Perhaps job interviews as well. PE classes, for example. So we really connect the role play to the home culture to validate our students' norms and to learn what our students already know. And then we build on that knowledge. Again, we always see our multilingual learners, all of the assets that they bring, and we want to know those assets and leverage them. So you can enhance this learning with supporting activities like reflecting, comparing, and sharing about social norms, social interaction in the cafeteria, for example, talking about rationale behind expected behaviors at a job interview. We just shared an article, if you're signed up on our newsletter, about job interviews. And a lot of our multilingual learners, especially our older kids, might be looking for jobs if they're, we have to handle the very sensitive nature of documentation and, being able to apply for a job. But these are very unwritten norms, and we have to be just, intentional about teaching these with our students. So our third tool is looking at curriculum as a mirror and a window. So this aligns with the SEL competency of social awareness. And so in the chat, let us know, are you familiar with this term, mirrors and windows? So we know that mirror books reflect your own personal identity and identities of students, and window books share experiences different from your own. So they help strengthen your sense of empathy, and they help you see things from another perspective and learn more about the world. And so we suggest having students really look at the diverse texts in their own context. And so here we have a student-facing text analysis tool with some scaffolds for students. And we also have an educator-facing tool. And so we also encourage teachers and students to collaborate with school media specialists, librarians, to undertake a diverse text analysis audit in the school library. It's really fascinating to do. And we talk about in the book how we were doing some school visits in a place that had experienced a big increase in the number of refugee and immigrant students. And we noticed in the high school library, they really didn't have any books that represented their new students' cultures and languages. And so we talked with the ESL director, and they were going to make some big changes and be more inclusive of the students so they could see themselves in what was offered. And so our fourth competency, our fourth tool, as Mindi mentioned earlier, this aligns with the SEL competency of relationship building and how important it is to have at least one adult that you have a good relationship with. And so this tool, we know that it's critical to build relationships between students and all school staff. And to do this, we have to take an audit of our students' relationships. So this is a third grade example where you would have a photo of each of the teachers, support staff, cafeteria workers, janitors, counselors, principal, assistant principal, so many staff that students would see. And then we want students to identify and just check who they have a good relationship with. And many times you'd be very surprised. Some students, you might not think so, but they might say they have a good relationship with a teacher that you hadn't really expected. Or especially then for teachers, for students who were not able to check a box, those are the students you would really need to follow up with and be intentional about developing a relationship with them. And our last tool that we'll share for right now is the decision-making graphic organizer. So this tool supports the competency, the final competency of responsible decision-making. And it's relevant also for school counselors. So the purpose is to model, you would, as a teacher, model your own real-life decision-making process about a decision that's authentic and relevant by thinking aloud and filling in your responses to the reflection questions included in the graphic organizer. And, we want to stress that you wouldn't do this with each decision that you would have to make. In the course of a day, we make hundreds, if not thousands of, little decisions up to big decisions. An example is a high school junior who's thinking about applying to college, a multilingual learner. And she just learned that colleges are expecting to see extracurriculars. But she has the responsibility, like many of our multilingual learners do, of taking care of her siblings at home after school while one of her parents works. And so her decision is, how can I balance my responsibilities at home with having an extracurricular activity or two that a college might be looking for? So these are some nuances that maybe our non-multilingual learners, students, don't always have to consider. So we've just shared a lot with you. And we're going to have you take part in our second poll. If we could open it up. Which tool would you like to try or learn more about? And you have access to all of these tools on the Padlet as well. So if we could start this poll. Great. And just open up. So sentence starters to support self-awareness, role plays, diverse text analysis tool, the one adult I have a relationship with checklist, or the decision-making graphic organizer. So we'll let you take a look. And in our book, there are 5 competencies. We share at least 4 tools and strategies per competency. So you're getting just 20, at least 20 alone on the SEL competencies. And then we have many different tools and strategies as well. So we can end the poll, and it looks like most of you chose sentence starters to support self-awareness. I'm sharing the results. I can't see if you see it or not, so hopefully you can. So that came in first, followed by the one adult I have a relationship with, and then kind of tied decision-making graphic organizer, role plays, and then the diverse text analysis tool. So thank you. So we are going to move into setting some goals for implementing this framework and some of these tools in your context. So I just want to point out that on the Padlet as well, we share the SEL look-fors and planning tool. So this as a practical tool. How many times have I said tool this presentation? I feel like to help educators plan to integrate SEL with multilingual learners. Again, not as a separate standalone program, but as an interconnected component of instruction to really promote our multilingual learners' comfort, well-being, relationships, and access to content while developing language. So this looks at 3 areas: routines and procedures, instructional practices, and language use. So a lot of times when people think of SEL, they're just, they're thinking of the managing, emotions and self-awareness. But really, if you walk away with one thing, I hope you'll walk away with our intent to integrate SEL as a really needed component for language learning and access to content, as well as, of course, well-being and relationships. So we've shared a lot with you. I'd like to ask you one step that you would like to take immediately. Whoops, I'm trying to move my things on my screen so I can read this, and I'm just clicking to strengthen SEL practices for MLs in your context. So in the chat, share one step you would like to take to immediately strengthen SEL practices for MLs in your context.
So I just want to say, Diane, that as you were sharing a lot of those tools, there was a lot of conversation going on in the chat about how important a lot of this will be at the start of the school year. So I think it's really great that people are already starting to think about, what pieces you might, make sure that you kick off the school year with some of these tools and strategies.
Great. Yeah, definitely the timing is very, very appropriate of this book coming out as we're thinking, of wrapping up this year and going into next year. And I would also, like to point out in addition that many times our multilingual learners come throughout the year. So we often have these great icebreakers, getting to know you activities, but also I would encourage teachers to think about doing this throughout the year, like very intentionally building these relationships as our students come in and as their relationships change throughout the year. Especially we think of our adolescents, right? Our middle schoolers, older kids. How they relate to other students really changes so much as they develop. So yeah, again, I would encourage you to think about integrating these tools throughout the year. Maybe each quarter you might be changing student groupings. We have a tool for that in the book, to think about how you group students and why you group multilingual learners. So yeah, we really encourage you to give thought to when and how you'll use these tools. Yeah, and I see a lot of great quotes coming in. Yeah, what you will be doing.
Yeah.
So I believe, go ahead, Mindi.
I was just going to say a lot of comments about thinking carefully about validating what students are bringing. So yeah, that's really great to see.
Great. I'm glad you can share the tools with your team. So I guess if we have questions, you can type them in the chat. Oh, great. Tori, I'm glad you like the resources on the Padlet.
Yeah.
And Patricia's a music teacher. Oh, wonderful. I've seen music teachers do wonderful things with language for their multilingual learners.
And I also see a lot of comments about people wanting to bring them back in some way, either with your team or at a grade level PLC. So that's really a great way to share a lot of the tools.
Yeah, Martha's asking if any materials in Spanish. So we do have some Spanish examples in the book. We haven't specifically created the tools in Spanish, recognizing that in many districts we work with, there are many languages in addition to Spanish. But if you have any questions, contact us and we can find some for you.
So I do see one question in the chat, Catherine Perry asking, how do you bring parents into this process? So we didn't really talk too much. We do have one piece about family engagement in the book where we talk about how important it is to bring parents into this process. We certainly want parents to understand what social emotional learning is and what it looks like and why you're doing it, but also getting their perspective around what they feel is important for their students to be learning around social emotional learning.
I'm scrolling to see if there are any other questions specifically. So we do have a minute or two. Thank you so much. And I saw another question about, is there a specific sequence, I think? Yeah, sequence of skills. I get caught up on where to start and where to go next. Mindi, do you want to talk about that or?
Well, one thing that we have certainly noticed in our work is that a lot of the competencies and the skills that we're teaching within the competencies do overlap. And a lot of what we are recommending in terms of supporting English multilingual learners will also overlap. Like we want to make sure that we're, validating their experiences. We want to make sure that we're providing scaffolds. We want to make sure that we're providing language that students might need. So I think even when Castle talks about their competencies, there's not necessarily an order, but it's certainly something, where students are going to need to start from understanding themselves the best that they can, which comes through self-awareness in order to really be able to address what they need to in the other competencies. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's my thinking.
Yeah. And also we encourage you, we asked you to think about which areas stood out the most for you. What are you seeing, right? Is it a need to build relationships? Is that what you're seeing as a big issue for you? Or do you think your students maybe aren't making the best decisions, for example? So it also comes down to what you're seeing. We also, in our final chapter of the book, talk about some guidelines for conducting multilingual learner student advisory groups. And these have been so important to us in shedding light on what students themselves see as being the most important to them, what helps their learning, what hinders their learning, what helps their SEL and their well-being in general. So we would really encourage you to think about having a student advisory group and asking them these questions. We often think it might be better for someone in addition to the teacher to ask some of these questions. They might not always feel comfortable, but you know your students the best. And quite often we don't have their voice in our process of developing instruction and integrating SEL. So I think we are about ending our time here. So we just want to thank you so much. Here are our email addresses, and we hope to continue this conversation.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane and Mindi, for such a rich conversation. Thank you to Jasmine for all your support of this presentation. This was fantastic. And as I did mention, if you attended today, you will be receiving a certificate of attendance along with the recording via email. So thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your evening or morning or afternoon, whatever it is where you are.
Thank you.
Thanks.